Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar. And I want to thank my friend Fatih Birol and so many others for joining us. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm the founding director here at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. And we're here to talk about the new IEA report on green recovery and green stimulus. I think, as everyone knows, the global economy is reeling after lockdowns designed to slow the spread of the coronavirus. Global GDP is projected to contract 5% this year. In the US alone, 35 million people are receiving unemployment insurance or waiting for it. We've seen second quarter US GDP projected to fall at an annualized rate of 30%. And in response, nations around the world have spent more than $15 trillion boosting their ailing economies. The US Congress has spent $3 trillion and is debating trillions more. Meanwhile, in this country at least, we see the virus continue to surge, raising concerns that further lockdowns may be necessary, or even if they don't come, that consumer fears about the pandemic will discourage shopping, dining, traveling, other forms of economic activity. So many leading economists caution that without further trillions in additional stimulus, that economic rebound may stall. And against this backdrop, of course, we continue to see the urgent challenge of addressing climate change more quickly. The collapse in economic activity has not only spurred trillions in dollars and euros and yen in government stimulus spending, but it has prompted calls to build back better by making the recovery a greener and less carbon intensive one. So today's topic is to talk about how we might do that and to discuss the findings from a new IEA World Energy Outlook special report on sustainable recovery. Let me first quickly say this event is being webcast live. The full video will be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in the coming days. For those of you joining via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those watching the live stream anywhere else, you can submit a question via Twitter using the hashtag CGEPLive and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy. We have a really fantastic set of experts to speak about this topic today, and I'm delighted that our keynote speaker is my friend, the executive director of the IEA, Fatih Birol. Fatih needs no introduction to anyone watching a webinar about green recovery. I do want to just thank Fatih and acknowledge his leadership of the IEA during this very difficult time, from rallying nations to address a historic oil market collapse, and now trying to rally nations to take stronger climate action toward a green recovery. I know just in about a week or so, he's bringing ministers together for the IEA Clean Energy Transition Summit, a key climate gathering for the year of 2020. After Fatih speaks and we chat for a few minutes about the report, then we'll hear more detail about the report from Laura Cozy, who is the IEA's chief energy modeler. She oversees all the agency's work on outlooks and forecasts and is in charge of overall consistency of modeling work and result messages. She is the head also of the Demand Outlook Division with responsibility for producing the annual World Energy Outlook, the IEA's flagship publication. Then we'll hear a few responses to that from two colleagues and friends, Dr. Joe Aldi, with whom I worked in the Obama White House. He's now a professor of practice at the Harvard Kennedy School. In the White House for President Obama, he helped to lead the efforts to design the $90 billion in clean energy stimulus spending in the Recovery Act. And Dr. Noah Kaufman is a colleague of mine at the Center on Global Energy Policy who leads much of our work on climate policy. He is an economist who held senior roles previously in the White House, at WRI, and at NERA Consulting. Thanks to all of you for making time to be with us today. Fatih, let me turn to you for some keynote framing remarks about the report, please.
Thank you very much, Jason. It is great to see you again, and also Joe after several years, and it's of course very nice to see Laura again. So this is my colleague at the IEA. Jason, I wanted to put it our sustainable recovery plan, we call it, in a context in the IEA, what we have done. As soon as the pandemic broke out, we had a strategy, we built a strategy, and this strategy has three components. First, we wanted to make a assessment of damage of COVID on the energy sector. What is the impact of COVID on the energy sector, on energy use, on investments and others? This was the first one. Second, we also wanted to show the world how one can put the clean energy at the heart of our recovery efforts. This is the second. And third, we are bringing, as you also mentioned, the several governments around the world in 2 weeks, how to implement such a plan or different plans to get out of the recovery. So 3 things together: damage assessment, a roadmap, blueprint, as some people call it, and third, the implementation political part of it. Now, before these 3, I wanted to remind many people, many colleagues who are listening us, that we were the first one, or one of the first ones, I should say, being on the model side, who called very early a clean energy transition should be at the heart of the recovery plans, just in the beginning of this thing. And then we made the damage assessment. Damage assessment tells us that we see a big decline in energy demand, for sure, oil demand especially, and also CO2 emissions. Our numbers show that the emission decline this year will erase the increase of global emissions in the last 10 years. There's a big decline. It is much, much larger than the 2008-2009. But as I said before, I don't think this is something, normally we should be happy to see a decline in emissions. But I don't feel happy because it is not happening as a result of the right energy policies. It is happening because of the economic trauma. It is happening because of the premature deaths. And as such, there is a major risk of rebound of these emissions, maybe even higher than before. So this is the one assessment we make. Another one is on the investment front. We are seeing the lack of investment almost every source of energy technology, and there is a big hit on the energy sector. So this is damage assessment. Second, we thought we should come up as IEA with a recovery plan. And this recovery plan should be sustainable. Because we say it is a once in a generation in scale, the opportunity. The reason is that up to now, we have about worldwide close to $10 trillion on the table, and another 10, they say it is on its way towards the end of the year. Where this $20 trillion will go, and what kind of energy policies will be included here, will determine many, many years our energy system. If I may give one example, learning from history, and I'm sure you remember is very well, Jason, because you were in the administration at that time. After the 2008 financial crisis, 2009, we have seen emissions declined by 0.4 gigaton, but 2010, emissions increased by 1.7 gigaton, so 4 times higher than the decline the previous year, mainly driven by Asian economies and their plans at that time. Now, we said, and I met Laura, I told Laura, because Laura led this project on behalf of the IEA. I said, Laura, we are living in this planet like everybody else, like the people in Bangladesh, in Africa, in the United States and everywhere. Their main concern today, I have to be frank, is economic growth and jobs. These are the 2 main concerns. Of course, thinking about the future energy system is important, but the burning issue is this. So therefore, we designed a study which looks at three things. One, choosing energy policies, one, boosting the economic growth, or had to boost the economic growth. Second, create jobs. And third, prepare a clean energy. And of course, there are many technologies that we have all the technologies at our disposal in all the data and analysis, but looking at the 30 different technologies or energy policy options, we focused on three main ones. One, energy efficiency, especially building renovation, insulation, fixing the windows in the industry sector, the manufacturing sector, improving efficiency there. As I said a few days ago, energy efficiency is a job machine, job creating machine. It creates jobs, 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 jobs. It is, we have seen that. Energy efficiency is number one. Number two, accelerating solar and wind installments. They are, especially solar, very good in creating jobs. And third, modernization and strengthening of the electricity grids around the world, networks, electricity networks. These three altogether do give a boost to economic growth, about 1 percentage point, create 9 million each year jobs, and third, does two things. One, avoids the rebound of the emissions and puts the emissions in a structural decline. And we focus on only on the next 3 years, 2021, 2022, 2023. Next 3 years, just focusing on that. And the economic part of this work, we work with the IMF, with their models, and the IEA's model that is supervised by Laura. And the results are very impressive. It helps the economic growth, it helps the job creation, and it helps the preparing a better future. And as I said before, there may be some governments who do not put the climate change as a key priority. No problem. But even those governments, in my view, need to follow our sustainable recovery plan, because they can use energy to create jobs and give a boost to economic growth. It is especially those policies that we have chosen. Now, after we made this report, to be very frank, I am not flattering anybody here. We have received tremendous interest from governments. Just before this meeting, Jason, I chaired a meeting with the Minister of Energy of Senegal and Africa, 14 African ministers, South African minister, Egyptian minister, Nigerian minister. They all want to work with us on a sustainable recovery plan. So, and we are talking about Africa now. So, of course, we made this plan. We will discuss with the ministers, and I am very thankful to all these colleagues who peer-reviewed this work, including some very clever professors in Columbia University. Thank you very much, and those professors had a lot of hands-on experience from the previous financial crisis and the lessons from those. And I would really stop here. And if you have any questions, I will be very happy to take. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatih, and thanks for your leadership on the report and highlighting the importance of trying to build back better. Before we come to the recommendations you make in the report, I just want to return to what you said at the outset, which was the projections the IEA had for the decline in emissions this year, but you noted in 2010, emissions bounced right back. Given what you see happening in the world today, it's been a little bit of time, maybe a month or two since you put out some of those numbers. I mean, when you look at traffic data in Beijing, when you look at how economies are starting to reopen, is there anything that makes you think we are not going to return pretty much to the way things looked before once economies start to reopen?
To be very frank with you, Jason, there are not many reasons which makes me believe that there will be a new world after the crisis. I have very few reasons there. I can give you two examples. One is the data, hard data. The first 5 months of this year, approvals for the coal-fired power plants in the world, mainly Asia, is 2 times faster than 2019. This is number one. Number two, there is a debate, have we seen the peak oil demand? We will never come to 100 million barrels per day issue. And I would say that in the absence of a major government policy changes, if the economy rebounds, I would expect that we will go back, maybe not immediately, but sometime soon, back to the 100 million barrels per day, and maybe even beyond. So the teleworking alone will not help us to meet our energy and climate goals. Government policies might well do so, in my view. So it is the very reason why we made this report with the second and third wave of stimulus packages to put the right policies in place.
Yeah, I mean, we published something not long ago raising the concern that a focus on economic growth and concerns about energy security as well may lead a country like China, for example, to double down on carbon-intensive industries as a pathway to reboot the economy. Do you see, and there's been some reporting about that, do you see things that make you concerned about that?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to be very frank. Not many governments in today's world puts in real policy making climate change as their primary concern. We have to be clear. I am not talking about what people say in the televisions or in the newspapers and their blogs, tweets. In the real life, because we look at the data. When you look at the data, there is a obvious decalage between there's obvious a difference, glut between what is said, what is promised, and what is happening in real life. And now what we are trying to say with this report, it is now in your country's interest, economic and jobs interest, to use these things, to use these policies, and this will also help to reduce the emissions. This is the message that we are giving today. Even if a country doesn't say climate change is my main concern, they should still push energy efficiency. They should still push to solar in order to create jobs. Today, according to our numbers, 3 million people in the energy industry already lost jobs. And we expect another 3.5 is at risk towards the end of this year. Altogether, it can come to 6.5 million people. And this is only the energy sector. Therefore, what we will hear in the next months to come, employment being a major challenge, and here we provide an opportunity for employment.
And can I ask you, as countries think about how they prioritize where they put stimulus money, and obviously resources are limited, so there's always some trade-offs to make. Joe may talk a little bit about this. Some of the retro post hoc studies of the US recovery package tried to answer the question about how much of what that 90 billion helped to generate would have happened anyway, and how much was an additional reductions on top of what consumers would have done. They would have bought a more efficient appliance, but they pulled demand forward a little bit to get the rebate or something like that. And related to that is how you think about the stimulus spending this report suggests. How should that be informed by policy? So if you have a zero emission vehicle standard, if you have a mandate for 100% renewables in the electricity sector, you have to make choices about where to spend money. Some of that is going to be driven by policy. What does that mean for how governments should think about how they prioritize where they put their stimulus spending?
So this will, of course, change from government to government, economy to economy. But in the United States, one area that I feel desperately needs attention, in my view, is the electricity grids. There is a huge need for electricity grids. This is good for the for renewables, the accommodating renewables in the system, good for resilience of the electricity system of US, and the interconnection of different parts of the country. It is in my view, if I was a decision maker, I will focus on that. Now, in terms of renewables, to be honest with you, I was very impressed with the US now extending the tax credits for the renewables, for solar and wind. This is a very good news. Another area, maybe not everybody would agree with me, but the lifetime extension of nuclear needs to get some attention as well. This is a zero emission technology. Why should we why we should make most out of this? So there are, of course, areas for US to look, and I am very happy that the US Secretary of Energy, Mr. Dan Brouillette, is going to join our meeting on 9th of July, like many others.
Yeah, that's great. Let me ask you one last question. We have from some of our viewers. One of them is someone you know well, Ian Khan, who asked a question through the Zoom chat, agreeing with your 3 areas of focus, but asking about building blue hydrogen hubs as part of your solution, and also how to encourage consumers to take up efficiency programs. He talks in the UK about when home insulation was free. Even then, the take-up was minimal. And I guess related to that question about hydrogen, I was also curious about how you think about the time frame. You know, one thing we saw in the United States was the need for stimulus to be timely, targeted, temporary. What could you deploy quickly that limits what's on the table? And when you think about some of those longer term technological solutions, and also how long this economic downturn may last, yeah, how do you think about policymakers should think about the time frame in which the dollars need to be deployed?
So first of all, greetings to Ian. Now, what we are suggesting is that the immediate attention should be given to these 3 important, in my view, areas: energy efficiency, renewables, and grids. Of course, many countries are also using this opportunity, their recovery packages, in order to provide an advantageous position for their industry. For example, you mentioned hydrogen. This is very important. Now, in my view, hydrogen is ready for the big time. Hydrogen is now today there where solar was 10 years ago. What is the problem with hydrogen? We have basically 2 problems. One, the cost. The second one is infrastructure. Infrastructure can be done if the governments take it serious, and many governments do, by the way, not necessarily for climate reasons, but to have a good positioning in terms of their industry sector, and there is a race among the countries around the world. The problem is the cost of electrolyzers. Electrolyzers make about 60% of the total hydrogen cost. An electrolyzer is a machine which is not a rocket science. By mass manufacturing, by learning by doing, you can bring the cost down, like the solar. And Europe is pushing it very strongly now in their Green Deal. Japan is doing the same thing in a big time. China is doing the same thing. And also Canada is doing the same thing. And I believe there will be a big race for hydrogen. The incentive for the efficiency, very simple. UK, in fact, yesterday I was witnessing the UK parliamentary, all-party parliamentary commission. I told them in the UK, when you look at the buildings, bulk of the buildings are over 30 years old, about 75%. Giving an incentive to the owners, just fixing the windows or insulation to give them some incentive in terms of tax breaks and others, which will create a lot of jobs, reduce the emissions, and improve the energy bill. It is a very mundane, but a very good functioning project. Now, just to finish by saying, Jason, that I am very happy that the work we have done get a lot of resonance, and 9th of July, we are bringing some 40 governments around the world, the ministers from United States, Canada, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, all European countries, Chinese minister, Indian, Indonesia, Japan, all of them will be the United Nations Secretary General to discuss this issue and hopefully to make a joint work globally. This is the thing. You mentioned the building back better. I would say building back better together. So we all have to do it, and IEA will continue to be the driving force for global clean energy transition. I thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and to my dear colleague Lara Cosi for her kind presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks for making time to be with us and for your leadership on these issues. And the Clean Energy Transition Summit is an important event. July 9th, we'll be watching. There's many other questions, but I want to give Laura and Joe and Noah a chance to participate in responding to those as well. Please stay with us if you can, but let's turn to Laura to go a bit deeper into the report now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fatih.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you very much to Dr. Birol for his introductory remarks. I'll share my screen now. I hope you can all see it. I'll go a bit more in depth into what Dr. Birol already mentioned. Basically, the premises of this study were very much looking at where we are economically globally. So as Jason mentioned this earlier, we are very much in the deepest economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. When you look at unemployment globally, you mentioned the 35 million in the US. Globally, we are looking at 300 million people. So we really said what we need to try to do here is to look at three objectives simultaneously: boost the economy, create new jobs quickly, and the third, as Dr. Birol mentioned, is really try to improve energy resilience and sustainability simultaneously. So what we did was the following. Basically, we looked around the world, 30 sets of policy options, building bottom up. Clearly what applies to the US doesn't apply to Senegal. What applies to country in Asia doesn't apply to Europe. So we really went into a big granularity, country by country granularity, working not only with governments, but a lot with industries, because what matters here is creating jobs immediately, is not in 5-10 years time, is tomorrow, day after tomorrow. So what is the project pipeline? How can we accelerate this project pipeline? Which are the key projects that are ready to go and could be just accelerated with a quick policy action? So building this bottom up, what we find is that what would be needed globally every year for the next 3 years, so 2021, 2022, 2023, is 1 trillion. We can come back in a second is how much is this 1 trillion? Is it more money or is it little money? Where would this money needed to be spent? First of all, we identify electricity. And here, two areas of electricity. We often talk about electricity generation, and clearly we find solar being the largest job multiplier. So solar, wind, but not only. So nuclear lifetime extension, hydro repowering, all crucial. At the same time, grids, modernization of grids, and where possible, grids extension. Now, efficiency, big basket there. Efficiency means a lot of different things in different areas of the world. Building refurbishment is going very big in Europe today, is not the only one that we could be pushing. We have seen a lot of potential, for example, in agriculture and agriculture efficiency in emerging economies, but also SMEs, the potential for pushing motors efficiency is very large and could pay back very quickly. You have another basket there, which is other. It touches upon, Jason, what you have mentioned earlier. So it's innovation. We see and identify 4 technology priorities here for strategic positioning going forward, batteries being the first one, hydrogen, CCUS, and SMRs. This other section also includes more local action, such as building recharge stations for electric buses and so on. So this is the premises. We have a menu. Everyone can go and look at it on the website. When governments are trying to build these new recovery packages going forward, they can look and understand what fits best for them. If we are able to mobilize this amount of capital for the next 3 years, what are the key 3 outcomes? First of all, the analysis with the International Monetary Fund, very clear. It shows you would boost the economy. The results is a larger economy in 2023 by 3.5%. What does it mean? That it means basically adding a G7 country in 3 years. It means adding the economy of Japan. Who would benefit the most is emerging economies. The productivity of capital there we find is very high. You have higher areas of the world where you could push electricity and give immediately access to not only health facilities, agricultural pumping, and small and medium enterprises. So a higher productivity there with larger potential for growth. So a big economic story is behind this sustainable recovery stimulus on energy. Second is about jobs. Dr. Birol mentioned this earlier. We have done for the first time a big database on global jobs in the energy sector. We find that today there are 6 million jobs at risk. These range from solar, oil and gas, but also efficiency, 6 million jobs. So does the plan manage to compensate the losses and create more? The answer is a yes. We would be able to create for every year around 9 million new jobs. Which areas? So here it gives you a bit the granularity. Clearly, electricity is the one that grows the most going forward, with solar, wind, as I mentioned earlier, repowering, hydro, extending nuclear lifetime extension is the big chunk of jobs that would be either retained or created. Buildings efficiency, as Birol mentioned, we call it a bit of a jobs machine, is not the only sectors. We see also fuels, other emerging technologies, car manufacturers that need a big support now would also be able to maintain and retain some of the potential job losses. Now, the resilience part of this plan is important. It focuses mostly on electricity. Dr. Birol mentioned that this is the case for the United States, but it is really a global issue that we are highlighting. We are seeing a warning sign of investments declining in the electricity grid globally, but the need would really be to increase if you want to make sure that we progress with making sure that the systems are stable, that we continue to have Zoom meetings without the light turning off while having more variable renewables in the system. We need to see a significant increase in grids. And this is the key element that we see across the world to enhance reliability, efficiency, and flexibility. And finally, the last slide is about the sustainability of the plan and what does it mean for emissions. So Dr. Birol mentioned already what happened in the past. I know that I've seen also papers from Joe, Aldi, and others that look at what happened in the past, and very similar results we find here. There was a big decline at the time of the global financial crisis. The stimulus back then created a very big rebound in the immediate aftermath, so just the year afterwards. But what's important is that we created a new age of capital stock that was very carbon intensive. Now, 2018, 2019, we had flat emissions. Now, the extent to which emissions will go down this year, it's uncertain. We do still believe that it's still going to be a very big dip, but where do we go from here? So we have done this analysis and we see 2 very clear and very different paths. One option, we go with stimulus packages that are similar to what we have done back in 2008, 2009. Emissions will start to surge again very quickly, latest by 2023, we would be above today's levels. This means that we would not be able to meet any climate stabilization targets. Now, if we were able to mobilize this $1 trillion over the next 3 years, we would, very importantly, be able not to go above 2019 levels and start a structural decline in emissions. So the difference between a path with and without recovery is around 4 gigatons. It's significant in 3 years' time, and importantly, it would avoid going back up to the peaks we have seen in 2008, 2009, in 2018, 2019. And I would conclude here and leave the floor to other colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting presentation and great report. We have a lot of things I want to ask you about, but let me turn to Joe and Noah for some comments and response. Joe, can I start with you?
Yes, thanks, Jason. It's great to be here. Thanks to Fatih and Laura and all of their colleagues at the IEA for this excellent report. It's really a tremendous resource, and I'd like to make sort of three key comments building off of their work and their presentations here. First, I think that it's an illustration of why international organizations can be so effective and so important for policymakers and stakeholders around the world. When I reflect on the experience in the fall of 2008 and the winter into 2009 as we were crafting the Recovery Act in the United States, we didn't have this kind of resource to draw from. And policymakers around the world didn't have a resource like this to draw from. We were all, I think at times, sort of duplicating efforts, whether it was here in the United States or in Europe or in Beijing, thinking about what role clean energy and climate-oriented stimulus efforts could play as we were trying to build a recovery program after the financial crisis. But this IEA report here is incredibly detailed, both in the identification of policy options as a kind of menu, as Fatih and Laura alluded to, but also backed by rigorous evidence and analysis that reflects what I think is part of the best that we can hope to expect from our international organizations, and that providing this analysis and this information is clearly a public good and is useful not just for policymakers and stakeholders in the United States, but around the world. So I think it's a fantastic piece of work that's going to help ensure that we have a more thoughtful, more productive policy debate about what economic recovery will look like going forward. So I applaud the IEA for this work. I do want to note, though, and in fact, Jason alluded to this earlier, the devil's in the details. And so the second point that I want to stress is the challenge of how we craft a stimulus package that is targeting on 2 objectives. And this is really difficult from a policy standpoint. We typically think that one well-designed policy can target well one objective. But here, we're trying to think about 2 objectives. How can we do something that will stimulate economic activity and create jobs and simultaneously address the risk posed by climate change? And so I think it's quite impressive, this work done here, but there's this challenge when we look country by country. And I thought it was important how Laura noted that the effort to sort of build this from a bottom up and think about what works in certain countries or certain economic and policy contexts versus others. But it's going to be really important to think about how we translate some of the outcomes that we think are going to be really important for job creation, or really important for delivering really significant changes in the investment in clean energy technologies. How do we make sure that we have the right set of policies to drive those changes and ensure that we're really targeting a change in investment behavior and economic activity that is both creating jobs and reducing our emissions? You know, part of this, when I think about some of the devil in the details here, is thinking through how do we really get some of the biggest potential labor market impacts. Some of this is going to be driven both on how labor intensive is the activity. So as has already been noted, solar installations and energy efficiency investments look to be more labor intensive. This is something that we looked at back in 2008 and 2009. We were thinking about an economic recession where a lot of the decline in economic activity in the United States had started in the housing sector. So we'd seen that building trades, workers in the building trades had lost their jobs or were working fewer hours. And so things that could draw those skills in a clean energy investment program. installing solar modules on buildings, doing energy efficiency retrofits in buildings would be a nice way to sort of take that surplus of labor that's being underused from the building construction industry and moving it into some of these clean energy investments. So I think it's important as we move forward and think through the crafting of what will be the economic recovery programs in the United States and around the world, that we're also trying to identify where do we see the biggest drops in different kinds of occupations and industries across the economy, and where we can sort of tailor our clean energy investments that will make it easier to move those workers into those new activities. So I think that's going to be, of course, one of the big challenges. Sometimes some of what we did, I think Jason alluded to this earlier, some of what we did in the Recovery Act didn't actually change much behavior on the margin. It may have been good moving money out, but sometimes trying to move money out quickly and doing it so in an administratively simple manner, which is advisable, I would say, sometimes you're not actually that effective targeting that incremental change. And so that's where taking this report and these analyses and then starting to think through on sort of a country by country basis and thinking through as well sort of the interactions of policies, which I'll get to in a moment, is going to be critical to see how well we can target both job creation and lower carbon investment going forward. The final point I want to make, though, is to think through the potential for overlapping policies and the impact that these overlapping policies have for the efficacy of a climate stimulus effort. And I think it matters when we think about these overlapping policies in two dimensions. First is recognizing that we can put more money into a program, we can decide to expand tax credits and tax expenditures for clean energy investment. But there may be non-spending policies, non-tax policies that are critical for that investment. And Fatih referenced this earlier in the context of the United States, when we think about the challenges of trying to build out the transmission system, especially high voltage transmission, trying to bring, say, renewable power from some of the richest parts of the country in terms of the solar resources in the desert Southwest or the wind resources in the plains. The challenge is those resources tend to be far from the people, and we need high voltage transmission to move the energy from those regions to where the people live. But here, the challenge is not so much can we finance the transmission. That's actually not that difficult. The bigger challenge is the siting and the cost allocation of those transmission lines and the kind of regulatory process at both the federal, state, and local levels a transmission developer needs to work through. More generally, there are a number of issues that come up when we think about siting large energy infrastructure that sometimes can sort of slow down those kinds of investments in the United States. So we may want to be careful and thoughtful about how we want to streamline those processes. So we don't want to undermine, I think, some of the environmental protections associated with those. We don't want to undermine, I think, some of the value of a democratic participation in those. But we also don't want those processes to serve effectively as vetoes or long delays for these kinds of low carbon energy infrastructure. So we want to think about, I think, the kinds of non-spending policies that may complement a program that's going to be spending resources through appropriation, spending resources through the tax code, that can ensure that we really undertake significant economic investment in the near term for clean energy. The second category of overlapping policies is recognizing that whether we're talking about China or the EU, emerging economies around the world, even a number of developing countries as they think about how they implement, say, their Paris framework pledges, but certainly here in the United States, when we think about the mix of federal and state policies, we should think through carefully how our investment in climate stimulus is going to work in conjunction with those federal and state policies. We have an array of both tax provisions at the federal and state level that already subsidize some clean energy technologies. We have a number of state policies, whether it's state cap and trade programs on carbon dioxide, state renewable portfolio standards that are already creating demand in the markets. And so I think understanding the interactions between these policies is going to be very important to see how we can target and get really big incremental changes in energy investment, given that policy landscape. And so to close, I think when we assess that kind of policy landscape, we should think about the role of near-term climate stimulus in the context of sort of three time frames or time horizons for action. There's the immediate action here over the next, say, 6 to 12 months, where we might undertake a significant economic recovery program where investing in clean energy and climate resilient infrastructure can be a major component for both job creation and the mitigation of climate change risk. But we should think about that in the context of what may be more medium-term policies, whether it's carbon pricing policies or a suite of policies oriented towards driving clean energy investment over the next decade or several decades, we'll want to ensure that the near-term stimulus complements that medium-term policy landscape, and that near-term stimulus and medium-term policies are laying the foundation for meaningful progress towards our long-term decarbonization goals. And so we want to make sure that we've got this kind of thoughtful sequencing of action that we need if we're going to be up to the challenge of combating climate change, and ensure that we're getting the biggest climate bang as well as the biggest employment bang for the buck when we think about the crafting of our economic recovery programs. Thank you, Jason, to you and your team for hosting this, and I look forward to our conversation for the rest of the webinar.
That was great. A really rich set of comments that raised a lot of issues. I'm going to turn to Noah, but let me just quickly, one quick follow-up, just so I understand what I hear you saying, Joe. Tell me if I characterizing it right. This in our minds, we think of this Venn diagram where there's a circle of things that are good in terms of spending of government money for the purpose of recovery and stimulus, and those may not mean the same thing, but famously, you can pay someone to dig holes and fill them, and you create economic activity. But we're trying to think about then the other circle in the Venn diagram is achieving another social objective, in this case, carbon reductions. And the question is, where is the overlap between those two things? So I'm wondering from your standpoint, do these broad buckets Fatih mentioned of efficiency, solar and wind, modernization of the electricity networks make sense? And how different, if someone said to you, here's $1 trillion, go spend it as effectively as possible for carbon mitigation, and now they say, do that, but also make sure that we stimulate economic activity, how different do those two places you land look?
Well, I think the important question here is thinking through, given the stimulus constraint, if you will. So what do you want to do on the climate and clean energy side that satisfies the stimulus constraint? If you're not going to do something in the United States on transmission siding, I'm not sure we can do a lot on transmission in the next 2 or 3 years. This was a contentious issue we dealt with in 2008 and 2009. Part of this, when we think about the design of the recovery package in 2009, is there were few new policies, meaning that we were using existing policies, existing programs, existing tax provisions, and just increasing and amplifying them, in some cases quite significantly. But we didn't do much that was really new policy. We had a few tweaks here and there. Transmission policy, if we were to do that, that's a big policy discussion and potentially a debate we need to have, I think. To be candid, when I think about how difficult it has been to try to build some of the transmission lines in the United States, when we recognize the important role it can play for clean energy. So when I'm trying to say, if we're applying that sort of stimulus constraint, if we're not able to sort of make some of the necessary policy reforms, there's some things that I think sort of fall out. There's some things like when I think about what we might want to do on innovation, it's not clear to me that that is something that satisfies job creation over the next couple of years. That I'd say it needs to be part of an economic recovery program, although it could be really critical when I think about what we need to do in the medium term in order to really amplify the returns from, say, a carbon pricing program. I mean, it could be whether transmission and batteries are two things that are going to be critical when we think about going really deep in the power system with renewable intermittent technologies. And I'm not, to me, there's a bit of sort of a competition here. I don't know which one's going to win out. Like if we solve the transmission problem, I'm not sure we need a lot of battery storage. And likewise, if we could do a lot of battery storage, maybe we don't need as big of a build out in transmission as we once thought. But I'm not sure either one of those, you're going to get a lot of job creation in the next couple of years. Whereas continuing to build out, say, solar, you could do, when you think about energy efficiency retrofits, those I can see as having near-term job creation benefits. So part of it, I think, is going to be a function of both the policy landscape that affects how quickly you can move out some of these investments, but also just how commercial ready are some of those technologies to really be able to make a big push in deployment in the next few years as a part of the recovery program.
Yeah, there's there's a question Elizabeth Mellenbrink asks, sort of related to that, we can come back to after Noah, about whether it's possible to implement these policies immediately, or is there a lag as you train and retrain the workforce? And part of this relates to how long we think this downturn will last. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, we recently had your former White House colleague, Jason Furman, on our podcast at Columbia, that this is going to be an extended downturn, and it's going to take many years to dig out of this hole, which may put on the table some things that we think matter for climate that wouldn't be on the table if you were looking at a much shorter time frame for economic investments. Let's come back to that. But Noah, please, let me turn to you next.
Great. Well, thanks, Jason. And I wanted to add my congratulations to Laura and the whole IEA team. I'm not sure how you pulled all of this together so fast, but you're making the rest of us look bad. I wanted to make just 3 quick points that draw from a commentary that we published last week that I hope will spur some discussion, and try to pull up just a couple slides to help me do it. So the first point I wanted to make is that spending on clean energy can complement the climate strategy, but in itself, it's not a climate strategy. Rapidly reducing emissions requires policies that directly address emissions, like prices or standards. So the spending within economic recovery packages is a good way to advance clean technologies, but it's a very circuitous way to reduce emissions. So that's why when the United States spent $90 billion on clean energy during the 2009 Recovery Act, which is a very green recovery package and a massive increase compared to the typical amounts that the United States spends on clean energy, it really barely moves the needle when you look at the carbon intensity of the economy. And the same is true if you look at the global level and the $500 billion that was spent worldwide on clean energy following the Great Recession. Can we do better than in 2009? Yes, of course. And especially, I think, with the help of roadmaps like what the IEA is providing. But we should not expect spending to solve the climate crisis. It's an inadequate policy tool. My second point is that the prospects of sustainable recovery are vastly different in different jurisdictions. So spending is going to be most useful in countries that already have strong climate policy frameworks in place. So if you look at this figure, those are the dots all the way on the right, where some of these countries, as examples, are labeled. These countries have net zero targets, carbon prices, other policies across the economy. The big remaining hurdle is to make the transition cheap enough that they can sustain the political will for it. And that's exactly what spending can do. Not coincidentally, the same policymakers that have put in place these policies are probably the ones most interested in taking advice of the IEA and others. So I'm very optimistic about the progress that these countries can make with their recovery plans. But a lot of the countries are in a very different position. The United States, for example, is lacking a climate policy framework, at least at the federal level, for spending to complement. And the Republican Party is going to stand in the way of any serious sustainable recovery plan for the foreseeable future. This doesn't mean that no progress can be made, but my expectations are low. That leads to my third point, which is that a rapid recovery may be more important to the climate than any specific climate-friendly measures and stimulus. There's a strong link between willingness to take serious action on climate and widespread economic prosperity. So if you just look at this same graph here, on the vertical axis is a metric of prosperity, the Human Development Index. And what you can see is that every single leading country on energy transition is markedly prosperous. This relationship holds within countries too. Climate legislation becomes more difficult to pass during economic downturns. And of course it does, right? Because when people are concerned about paying the rent, that's what policymakers in those countries are concerned about too. So in many countries, a rapid recovery and sort of digging out of the deep hole that Jason was just referencing is probably necessary to put serious climate legislation back on the table. These points are made in a commentary I mentioned that we released last week, so please check it out if you get the chance. And with that, I will turn it back to Jason, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Noah. Laura, I'd love to give you a chance to respond to some of what Noah and Joe just said, including the points Noah just made that, we saw a large investment in green energy. It didn't show the sort of fundamental shift in the emissions trajectory in the US that you modeled might be possible for the global economy. And I think what I heard him just say is, that maybe the best thing we can do for climate policy is to get the economy back as fast as possible and just let's focus on that objective. Can you react a little bit to what you just heard?
Thank you, Jason. Maybe two quick feedback on this. We looked back at studies and what happened in the 2008-2009 financial crisis. We clearly, in the energy sector, we are not in the same place. We are not in the same place because the cost of key clean energy technologies is 70 to 90% lower. It means that now building a solar plant is cheap, is the biggest job multiplier, and provides cheap electricity. It was not the case 10, 12 years ago. So we find ourselves in a very unique set of circumstances. I mentioned solar, but it's not the only case. We have wind, we have offshore wind coming very strongly. We have electric vehicles coming very strongly. So the suite of technology weapons that we have today is very different from what we had 12 years ago. So this allows us to have a multiplier in terms of economy, in terms of job creation, in terms of carbon reduction that is incomparably higher than what we had 12 years ago. So that's why we think that the decoupling that Noah showed didn't happen 12 years ago and at the global level, because we started a very carbon intensive raw investments everywhere, especially in Asia, as Fatih mentioned. It would be completely different now. Now, I think there is another very important point that Noah said, that clearly stimulus policies are not climate policies. However, there is we are at a very important crossroad here. We don't have very much time left. So if we get this wrong, the new set of infrastructure that we lock in is really putting us in a very, very difficult situation. So it's really whether do we have a choice not to make this next wave of stimulus packages sustainable. And from a climate perspective, the answer is pretty clear. So those would be the two quick reactions.
But just a quick follow-up to that. Maybe Joe wants to weigh in on this as well, because I think at least I could draw two different conclusions from that. One is, we don't have much time left. We've wasted a lot of time. Emissions have continued to go up, and obviously they're cumulative in terms of their impact. So how do we spend a certain amount of money on getting the biggest emissions reductions possible from that amount of money? The other way to think about it is what Noah just said, which is even if we could get an important or significant amount of emission reductions, what he said was we're not meeting our climate goals, we're not getting deep decarbonization without comprehensive economy-wide policy like mandates, standards, regulations, a carbon price, however you want to do it. So if that's the reality, spending whatever amount we spend, without that, we're not going to get there anyway. Should we think about what we spend money on, assuming that that policy is or will be there, and then try to spend money accordingly, where there might be market failures with building efficiency or something else, which is a slightly different frame on how you would think about prioritizing limited dollars. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. But if you look, I would go back to maybe what Fatih said earlier. There is a group of the Venn diagram you mentioned earlier. There are a few technology choices that are, if you want, there are no trade-offs anymore. There were trade-offs 12 years ago. There are not trade-offs anymore now. So this, regardless of the fact that there is a comprehensive climate policy in place or not, doesn't matter. In a way, it doesn't matter. So why wait? If you have a 2, 3, 5, depending on the countries where you're in, sets of technology options, investment options, where there is market appetite. We hear it from companies all over the world. And there is the technology there. There are the skills of jobs. This is something that Joe mentioned earlier. We looked at this as much as possible. The skills and jobs are there. So you could just move the people very quickly. They're there. So again, why wait? It wouldn't, I understand the different framing, but I don't find it very convincing. There are a small number of technology options that are ready to go. We should use the opportunity.
Joe, can you respond to that? And also that chart that Noah showed about the Recovery Act, you don't really see a kink in the curve. Does that give you pause about the numbers, say, Laura showed, which showed a very different future depending on whether we put that stimulus money to work?
Right. So I think there's a few key points here. One, if we spend money now on clean energy technologies, as Laura noted, we get these sort of near-term benefits, but certainly one of the lessons to draw from the effort in 2008, 2009 in the United States and around the world is that those aggressive policies to spend in clean energy helped create the markets so that the producers could make investments to lower their costs over time, and it helped contribute to the significant fall in the prices of a variety of technologies in solar and in wind. And as a result, you get this kind of positive spillover where, you know, one of the reasons why we've seen a lot of build out, I think, of solar in the last 3 or 4 years in the United States is because of investments that were made in 2009, 2010, 2011 in the US, as well as investments made in other parts of the world in response to green recovery programs that help make it that much cheaper for everyone to deploy it now. And that matters both for spilling over in terms of environmental benefits down the line as we see continued investment, but I think it also has a positive impact on our politics because we now have a larger business community that makes money in the United States installing solar panels. The more and more we can see that, and the more and more we can see that across in different regions of the country, I think that actually makes it easier to then think about the next step of policy. And I think it is important for us to have that next step, to have a more comprehensive medium-term policy framework that will actually help amplify the near-term investment to a stimulus program. It's the uncertainty about what the policy landscape will look like in the future that can deter some of the investments that would occur. You know, you might get someone who responds to say a subsidy for solar panels, installing solar panels now by building some, but if you're an investor thinking, should I build a new manufacturing facility that would produce solar panels or produce components that go into a wind turbine? If you still think that there's some doubt about what the future policy landscape might look like in the United States, it doesn't make sense for you to make that kind of investment in the manufacturing capacity for what might be a 2 or 3 year stimulus program. But if you think that 2 or 3 year stimulus program is the first step of a multi-step policy march, and those subsequent steps are going to create significant demand for your products, you're going to make more investments in the near term. So I think it's important for us to try to provide some more certainty about what the policy landscape will look like here in the United States and other parts of the world, so that you can actually help create even a stronger boost in that near-term stimulus. You know, the other thing that I think about though, when we're trying to think about crafting a stimulus and trying to think about its role in economic recovery, is this challenge that we're going to face politically about wanting to see really, really quick returns. There's one thing that when we look at sort of Noah's slides there, you know, the returns over the first couple of years may look fairly modest. They're probably, I would be quite confident, at least in the context of the United States, we were moving off of the trajectory we would have experienced otherwise. I think the failure to pass cap and trade legislation in 2010 probably made it harder for us to continue to move off of that trajectory and make a bigger change in our energy economy. But it also emphasizes the importance of taking action now because of how much time it takes to turn over our energy infrastructure. You know, some of the very initial analysis I did looking back at the Recovery Act suggested that in 2010, the build out of wind farms in response to both an extension of the production tax credit and the creation of a grant in lieu of tax credits for those wind farms probably reduced US CO2 emissions in the power sector by about 2%, which seems fairly modest, but if you're going to get that and sort of keep building on that over time, it's one of the key drivers, coupled with natural gas prices, on why we see US power sector emissions more than a quarter below what they were before the Great Recession. And some of the more recent EIA analysis suggests it's probably 50-50 between the role of gas and the role of the renewables build out. So I think it's one of these things where politically we've got to have a little bit of patience, which doesn't really resonate with policymakers. But part of what we're doing here is really trying to change this long-lived infrastructure. If we can do it with a major spending program in the next few years, that's going to have really long-term payoffs over time.
Noah, there's some great questions here from the viewers, and I want to bring them into the conversation, but did you want to quickly respond to any of that?
Yeah, I just wanted to be very clear that what I'm not trying to say with my remarks is that sustainable recovery package isn't a good idea. I think it is. If a policymaker called me up, I would point them to the IEA and say, absolutely do this. What I'm trying to say is that it shouldn't be the sole focus, because expectations, just from a climate perspective of what that spending is going to accomplish, needs to be kept in check. So I think looking back again to Joe and team in 2009, I think they put together a terrific clean energy package as part of the Recovery Act. But as he said, cap and trade legislation failed after that. And I think we should really try not to repeat that experience, that same experience where we get the spending, but we don't get the policy that we also need.
That's great. I'm damn curious, Laura, by the way, $1 trillion, when you have an input-output model, I mean, which I think is kind of how the job estimates were generated, I presume the more that was spent, the more jobs would be created. So why is $1 trillion the right number and not 2 trillion or half $1 trillion? How did the IEA determine what the optimal amount would be?
So actually, we looked back at how much money were invested in the energy sector over the past few years, and we really built it bottom up. So this is the amount of additional investment that would be injected. I think I go back to something that Joe said earlier. This is not all money that should come from governments. So in fact, we find that the non-spending measures that Joe mentioned are hugely important. So of the 1 trillion, we only find that 30% of that globally would need to come from government money. So this permitting, streamlining some of the permitting is clearly, I would say, top policy priority that we say a bit globally as being the one that can bring in private capital while making sure that we still achieve investment flowing and job creation. So the way we calculated the 1 trillion is looking back what happened and how much money would be needed in the next few years, looking at what is the possible project pipeline. So trying to anchor it as much as possible to what's feasible. And maybe I'll come back later on the feasibility question, which I think is an important one as well.
Yeah, well, comment on it now if you like, please go ahead.
If you look back again globally, global financial crisis 2008, 2009, globally, the amount of money that went into clean energy transitions was about 16% of the global amount of money that was channeled into global recovery. And if you look at what we are suggesting now, this would be equivalent to only 10%. If you look at only the government part, which is what we're interested in, is only 10% of what's been put forward up to now. So I think, again, this shows in a way that we are really not in the same situation we were 12 years ago. There are a range of opportunities everywhere. So I was looking at the jobs numbers for solar in the United States, 250,000 people employed today is huge. The solar industry is at risk as well. So we have to look also at what parts of the supply chains and industries are at risk. So feasibility and, as Joe said previously, look very closely at which areas are being affected now and in the longer term.
That's great. Thank you. Well, as I said, some people have been waiting patiently with questions. I know, Laura, you've been at IEA for many years. So one of the people waiting patiently is someone you know well, Nobuo Tanaka, who asked about the modeling you showed CO2 emissions peaking in 2019 with that sort of spending. Does that also mean a global peak of demand in oil at the same time? So there's, I guess, another recent Rystad report too. I think it was Rystad showing sort of this COVID could pull peak oil demand forward a couple of years. So anyway, Nobuo was asking about peak oil demand.
Mr. Tanaka, hello. Very nice to hear from you. So in our main analysis, as Dr. Birol mentioned, we are not expecting a peak in oil demand anytime soon. We are seeing very recent data on rebound in traffic in all major cities happening. The analysis that we're doing on the stimulus packages, basically the one that doesn't show a very big rebound hinges mostly on very steep reduction in coal use, something that we have seen already this year, while oil demand will still continue to increase. So the main driver of the emission reduction is largely coal displacement with larger integration of a number of low carbon technologies. So this would be the very quick answer.
Joe or Noah, there are several questions here. I'll just sort of consolidate them, asking about how all of this relates to a carbon price or a carbon tax. And that's broadly related, Joe, to what you were talking about, which is how does this complement other policy? But can you say a little bit about how the way we think about a policy like that, or the way we think about stimulus, is affected if you think that a policy like that may be coming or not?
So I think the prospect of a carbon price has a couple of important implications for stimulus. One, as I already noted, is I think it amplifies the returns to that spending. That you're, for a given policy instrument, say a given tax credit, I think you're going to get more build out if the investors see a world in which you're going to have, say, an economy-wide carbon tax. I think the second way that there's an important potential relationship between stimulus and a carbon tax is if we find ourselves, and this goes to one of the questions that was raised earlier about sort of the need for potentially longer term spending, is whether or not politically we're going to be able to do that. I think back to 2009, we basically had one shot at a recovery bill. In the end, I think that there was a general agreement among the economists in the administration and for those outside that we didn't spend enough money, that we transitioned to austerity too quickly. And after we passed the 2009 Recovery Act, it really wasn't until December of 2010, for a variety of political reasons, where we negotiated with the incoming House Republican leadership an extension of the Bush tax cuts, coupled with some of the Recovery Act provisions. We basically didn't have anything else that looked like stimulus spending over the course of 2009, 2010, even as we learned more about the depth and the breadth of the recession. And we could have used more there. Even when we had some things like Cash for Clunkers was actually paid for in part by cutting money out from the DOE loan guarantee program. So I think there is the potential that if politically, when members of Congress look back at the amount of deficit spending this year, what might be in an initial recovery program, that they may be reluctant to continue large-scale deficit spending for economic recovery, which I think would be quite adverse considering the prospects that we have for a long recession coming out of COVID, or at least a long period of relatively slow growth coming out of the COVID pandemic. There's the potential that you could do a carbon tax where you say, in the near term, I'm going to do additional spending on clean energy, and say 5 years in the future, I'm going to start implementing a carbon tax. And you could say, I'm going to use some of those revenues from the carbon tax to help pay for and effectively pay back, pay off sort of the borrowing that you did for that near-term stimulus. I wouldn't say that this would be sort of my opening shot. The opening shot should be do a stimulus package, do deficit spending. That's going to be the most stimulative thing you can do, and think about what part of that is going to be thoughtful investments in clean energy and climate resilience as well. But if politically we find ourselves in a world where after that first shot, we recognize we need more, but we can't get sufficient support for it, I think there's ways you could sort of create a combination policy that's near-term stimulus for clean energy with longer-term carbon tax to generate the revenues to pay that off.
There's a question from Paresh Patel about how to think about public investments in parallel to how you think about private investments, the role of capital markets, private investors. We've seen growth in the number of sustainable financial instruments like green climate sustainability bonds. That, Laura, that sort of comes to your point about it's not all government spending, it is also private capital. And then you talked about, the sort of changes to policy, like faster permitting and things that would drive that. And this comes to this question about timeframes and how quickly these things can be implemented. Ian Kahn raises that too in the chat, and sort of to have a big impact on recovery, we need significant investments in the economy very quickly. And it's difficult for those other complementary policies to move that quickly and to fit neatly. So the spending kind of overlaps neatly with these other policy instruments. So anyone can take that, but maybe Laura or Noah wants to, or Joe wants to come in on that.
I think this is it's a real issue, and it goes very much back into what Joe is saying. There is a time frame here that we need to look at. There is something that can be done now, here and quickly, and then there is a medium-term issue, and then there is a much longer-term issue. However, when we looked around at the number of projects that have been stalled, that could be actually just accelerated, giving policy certainty that things are going in that direction, is not negligible. The amount of, I go back always maybe saying the same thing, solar projects, wind projects that can just waiting to say, okay, go ahead, tax credits prolonged, move. Similarly, when we look at nuclear lifetime extensions or hydropower that could be repowered, or wind parks that could be repowered, that wouldn't require permitting of new land. It's there, but if we go with a new technology now, we would just generate 20, 30% more clean energy, while bringing back some of the works that are at risk today. So certainly there is, we are not blind to the difficulties. In Europe, there are some areas where, as in the United States, new transmission lines, for the time being, we cannot think about it. However, modernizing them, starting digitalization, starting smart metering, could be rolled out quite quickly and doesn't require a lot of new permitting. So there are, we do see a significant amount of projects that would be ready to take off.
Mm-hmm.
Jason, I'll just add that I think it's important here to emphasize the point that Laura made about how you can leverage private sector resources here. And that was I think a key part of what the US government, among other governments, did the last time around. When we think about the payoffs here, whether it's extending the production tax credit or the investment tax credit that helped really contribute to a lot of the build out of renewables, I think it's recognizing that you already have a significant private sector incentive to invest in energy. This is a different kind of stimulus than, say, road building. Road building is basically 100% public dollars. Here it gets to the point of how do we craft policies that can really target that investment in a way that's going to leverage new private sector monies coming off the sideline and going into clean energy investment. And I think that's one thing about how there's a kind of amplification here in terms of economic stimulus that we don't see in some of the other categories of potential spending that will be part of an economic recovery package. That's important, I think, to emphasize for both policymakers and stakeholders.
There's several questions. I'll sort of try to bring them together about beyond renewables, about technological innovation, several questions about hydrogen spurred from that conversation we had with Fatih earlier that Ian prompted. Skepticism that we're going to get anywhere close to the climate targets that we need to, and what that means for technologies like carbon removal. When you think about, and this comes back to this question of timeframes, again, Joe, you sort of talked about the importance of investment in energy innovation and R&D, how large the economic returns are to those investments, but they don't happen quickly. They don't create jobs quickly. So just several of the questions along the lines of how do you think about the role of stimulus spending in advancing those sorts of cutting edge technologies that, or advanced nuclear, there was a question about that too, that may well need to, we can't be certain, but may well need to be part of deep decarbonization, especially in hard to abate sectors. I'll let any volunteers jump in, or else I'll call on someone.
I'll jump in and quickly say a couple of things. One, pure innovation like R&D spending doesn't appear to really be that stimulative from a job creation standpoint. Having said that, one might say there's an economic recovery package moving. Let's be opportunistic and let's put in some money there for R&D. So, for example, in 2009, we put the initial appropriation for ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Project Agency at the Department of Energy. And it's been receiving appropriations ever since, even if some in the current administration don't appear to like ARPA-E. Fortunately, Congress still does, because I think there's a lot of value in taking the new approach to energy R&D that's reflected in the ARPA-E ethos and structure.
So you be clear, that's sort of a political economy argument. You say, let's not do any harm to the pace of economic recovery, but if we're going to spend a bunch of money on economic recovery and we can get some of that also for things that pay dividends over the longer term, let's take advantage of this political moment. That's what I hear you saying.
Yes, yes. I think the second thing I would say here is I am nervous about the political appetite for high risk, potentially high risk, high reward investments that we might think of as some of these innovative technologies. It could be that your partners disappear. And what comes to mind when I say that is future gen. There were several $1 billion set aside for a commercial scale carbon capture and storage power plant. But in the end, most of the American utility partners decided to pull out of the alliance that was going to split the cost with the federal government for that project. And in the end, we did a number of sort of smaller pilot projects. I think about the history in the loan guarantee program with Solyndra and just how much grief politically there was over Solyndra. And I always felt like we needed more Solyndras. The whole point of appropriating monies for the loan guarantee program was to actually end up supporting innovative commercial scale technologies, some of which would fail. Like if you're not willing to take the risk on something that might be a potential game changer down the line, but also might fail, then your policy isn't really pushing much out that's innovative at the commercial scale in this market. And if anything, I think it would have been better had we taken more high risk, high reward investments in, say, the loan guarantee program than what we did in practice. Having said that, of course, I wasn't around to deal with the political grief associated with Solyndra. So some of my colleagues, in fact, I think, Jason, you were still in the administration as Solyndra was becoming more and more of a political problem. That means you might not want to politically do that. But that illustrates the challenge of, like, do you really think that this is going to be the right space for public policy? The last thing I want to say about those who are skeptical about achieving climate targets, it's one reason, one really important reason why I think it's important to think more broadly than just clean energy when we think about climate stimulus this time around. That is, in 2009, in the US government, almost all of our spending was really focused on promoting clean energy as a way to mitigate our carbon dioxide emissions. But I think given both where the world has been over the past decade, our better understanding about the risk of climate change, we need to make investments not just in reducing our emissions, but in investments that's going to make our infrastructure more resilient to climate change risk, that's going to protect people from the threats from climate change, that those are going to have important economic and public health payoffs, just as investing in clean energy technologies will as well.
Yeah, and that point you raised about sort of, to what extent you're willing to accept some higher risk may also come to the point you made earlier about whether the investments you're making are marginal or incremental, or whether you're crowding out things that the private sector may have financed anyway. One of those technologies that there have been several questions about, Patrick Binns had a question about grid scale battery storage, and then Noah and my colleague at Columbia, Dan Steingart, who runs the fantastic Electrochemical Energy Center here, one of the leading battery experts in the world, was asking about batteries as well. And why wouldn't, his question was, why wouldn't battery development and manufacturing be a source of job creation? They didn't sort of fall into those categories of prioritization, I think, Laura, that you described. Maybe you can comment a little bit on the potential for batteries as a source of investment.
Actually, batteries is indeed one of the 4 areas where we call it strategic technological priorities. And it's very much, I think, here about hearing what Joe has been saying. There is also a bit looking around what's happening in the world now. So Germany just passed a huge hydrogen program. So part of the stimulus putting significant amount of billions of dollars for a hydrogen strategy, and we're expecting the European Union bloc to come with something strong about it soon. And they are also expecting something to come on batteries very soon, while we know that China has been investing tremendously in batteries. So in all our analysis, batteries are really essential, regardless of what's happening to transmission lines. So batteries are not only essential for the power sector, but for the future of mobility. We're seeing that as a very key component. So the short answer to the question is that, yes, it was identified as one of the 4 key strategic areas for investment. We completely agree with this.
Okay, great. We're just, please go ahead. You were going to say something else. And then I'll just give people a heads up. I'll just give sort of each of you, a minute or so to make any final reactions or comments that we haven't had a chance to get to yet. And then I think we'll be close to out of time. Please, Laura.
On the innovation part, as we really do see as well an immediate issue next 3 years. What do we do with to come out of this recovery? A medium-term issue to the 2030s, and then a long-term issue. So on innovation, we are coming out on, it's just an appointment to all of you actually. On Thursday morning, the executive director will actually give the key findings of a new innovation report where we actually do key innovation priorities where you will hear hydrogen, you will hear battery storage, but I think it's gonna really give a new framing to how we could shape innovation, including in the stimulus packages.
Great, thanks. Professor Steingart corrects me that he was reacting, Joe, to what you said about batteries and whether they would be a job creator or not. So you can comment on that if you wish, and then any final reactions or thoughts you have on the discussion. And then I'll turn to you, Noah.
I would be thrilled to be proven wrong. That what we could do in terms of large scale, I think utility scale battery storage is ready to move commercially and move in a way that creates a lot of jobs. You know, one thing we want to think about in crafting policy is making sure that if we are dedicating some programs that are potentially oriented towards riskier technologies, that in cases where those technologies don't pan out, we can quickly reorient those resources to where we do have both job creation and climate benefits occurring through other kinds of activities. There's one reason why I think there's value in thinking about the crafting of recovery programs for a kind of act, learn, act approach. That we're going to try to move quickly because of the economic imperative, but we need to be able to sort of collect, I think, the right kind of information and organize it in a way so we can quickly do analysis to figure out what's working well and what's not. Some of that will then affect how we might want to modify an existing program to make it more effective. It might serve in a way to say we want to increase resources going to a program that appears to be more effective. But it's to ensure that over time that we have enough kind of flexibility to adapt to this information and this knowledge to ensure that we're getting the most, both in terms of the jobs and the climate benefits from our economic recovery program. And let me also close by saying, Jason, thanks again to you and your colleagues for hosting this webinar, and thanks to Lara and everybody at the IEA for this phenomenal effort for the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Noah, final comment?
Yeah, just a couple things that came up in the discussion. I want to agree with what Joe said about R&D spending. I mean, I think spending on clean energy R&D is spending more than we do today is a good idea in any economy because of the high returns we expect from it over time. And I think you can say the same thing about public infrastructure that will facilitate clean energy technologies. So, I mean, absolutely, unless we think that there's some limit on spending that it's, you know, directly crowding out what we're going to spend on stimulus. Let's take advantage of the opportunity to do it if we can. And then the second thing, just to the point about skepticism about targets, I think that's actually a really important point. And I think the sustainable recovery plan that, you know, might make sense if we're going to achieve net zero in 2050 might look a whole lot different than the one if the world keeps muddling along at the pace that it's been going at over the last 5 or 10 years. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, but I do think it's an important one. So anyway, thank you to Jason and Laura and the whole IEA team. This is just an unbelievable resource for all of us.
Yeah, thank you. It really is a quick turnaround and a very helpful resource to all of us who are thinking about this. Thanks to all of you for joining. We are at 1 o'clock and we're going to wrap up. I just want to note one question that just came in from Hamis Youssef, who asks about, it's interesting because it asks about the issue of social justice, which has been brought to the fore, obviously, by several events, including what we've seen on the streets of the US and cities around the world. And his question is about, you know, to what extent any potential policy reactions to that may affect the way the IEA's outlook looks, including the examples of job creation, access to energy globally, among others. And I will just note, we had the House Climate Report, you know, just come out, and a major focus on issues of equity, environmental justice, and social justice in that. So when we talked earlier, you know, about that Venn diagram of reducing emissions, and thinking about economic recovery, but adding into that how we think about issues of equity and justice is increasingly and importantly something that policymakers are thinking a lot about. This is an area we're working on quite a bit at the Energy Center, and we'll have more events and discussions and papers on. So I just wanted to flag that because I think it's quite important. I'm glad he brought it up. So thank you to all of you for being here. I want to thank our speakers and panelists again. Dr. Brohl, although he's not here with us anymore, thank you for joining at the beginning for keynotes. As I mentioned, the full video recording of the event will be available on our website in a few days. Thank you again for the wonderful discussion. Thanks to so many people for asking such thoughtful questions. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.